Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week, it's going to be the turn of the American musician and composer Pat Irwin, who I spoke to very recently to find out more about life, love and poetry. He was part of that scene that grew out of New York City, the new no wave scene in the late 70s, early 80s, was in various bands including Eight-Eyed Spy and also the Raybeats, was also a member of the B52s from 89 through to 2008, and is currently performs and records with Sus, S-U-S-S, who have released several albums and has got one in the pipeline and some dates, and has done lots of film scores and various other bits and pieces. But you'll find out more about that and everything else in this interview. So after several minutes of interest but casual chat, we get down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years. Pat, it's over to you.
Oh, I've had several. But the first, I'm about a decade older than you, a little under a decade older. So clearly, watching the Beatles on television on the Ed Sullivan Show was a life changer.
Yes.
That opened up another world. And, at the same time, there was an entire British invasion of bands like, the Rolling Stones and the Kinks and the Animals that I was seeing. But at the same time, I was also becoming very aware of film music, particularly the music of James Bond movies. Yes. And that was a real awakening, Goldfinger and Thunderball. And I would say that was the first real awakening that I had. Later ones would have been Bowie, as you mentioned, and then The Clash and Susie and the Banshees. And I was living in London around that time, so I saw Wire and Susie and the Banshees and The Clash and avant-garde American jazz at the, what was the name? The center, the Arts Center in downtown London. Was
it the Roxy or somewhere like that?
No, well, I saw, I was in pubs and clubs, but there was also, it wasn't the Battersea. It doesn't matter. But I saw like Anthony Braxton and the Art Ensemble of Chicago and British musicians like Derek Bailey. And they were it was a real life changer.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
I had many awakenings.
Yes.
I continue to have them.
This is always important if we want to keep alive, really. But did you have sort of parents that had an influence on you, musically or culturally? Did they sort of have sort of anything on their walls or in their bookshelves or on the record player that they turned you on to at all, which kind of opened your mind?
No.
Not at all. That was it.
But they liked music. They particularly my father liked jazz, Ella Fitzgerald, Benny Goodman. He liked singers, but he liked Benny Goodman a lot. But they were not musical, and nor did they encourage me to be a musician.
Yes.
But it happened, and they didn't have much choice. So that's that.
There you go. Did you, when you got to sort of the ripe old age of, I suppose, 15, 16, this was the very end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. Did you sort of experience that kind of period from sort of, I suppose, 67? I'm not thinking you were taking lots of acid at that stage, but, the summer of love in 67, with, you know, various kind of happenings, kind of certain albums coming out, the excitement of the Woodstock moment. But then, you know, the next period, which was the death of Hendrix, Morrison, Joplin, Brian Jones the year before, and then, you know, Altamont. And it seemed like the 60s had started so beautifully. Well, not started, but that mid period was so beautiful. And then suddenly the party the party gets a bit sort of depressed. Did you sort of at that age, did you have that kind of sense of things going on and sort of happening and thinking, blimey, I'm just about to hit 16 and suddenly there's been this massive shift?
Well, you know, there was a whole bunch of American music coming out of California that had kind of a hippie idealism to it. You know, that was undeniable. But I didn't buy into it. I liked it enough.
Yes, but it
You know,
didn't
I
stick.
really liked the Who. I really liked the Kinks, and I liked American. I liked classical music too. You know, I liked whatever I could get my hands on. But you know, the dominant Woodstock culture, and I love that movie. Man, I went with my dad to see that movie. I remember that. I remember being blown away by Sly and the Family Stone in that movie. But I I can't pretend that I didn't like Crosby, Stills and Nash. I did, but it didn't take long, and I didn't buy it. So it was
Yeah.
just really a big, refreshing thing when I got to hear bands like, you know, Iggy Pop or the MC5, or from England, you know, a little bit later, Roxy Music or Bowie, you know, bands that, and then of course later the Ramones,
Yes.
just whatever bands, Patti Smith, Television, Talking Heads, Blondie, the Modern Lovers. Oh my goodness, the Modern Lovers changed my life. The Dolls. You know,
And
this is what I wanted to hear. These were people I wanted to know. This was music I wanted to listen to. And they
yes.
were just, it was no nonsense.
Yes. And when did you sort of, you know, go from being just interested in music to thinking, no, I want to be a little bit more, I want to be on the stage, I want to be in the recording studio? When did you get an instrument? When did a musical instrument appear in your life?
Well, I started taking clarinet lessons at a very young age. And those clarinet lessons were really impactful, and they are stuck with me to this day. I'm serious about that. I was studying with a bass clarinetist from the Cleveland Symphony. My family was living in Cleveland, and the guy's name was George Zetzer. And he was tough, and he was good. And he taught me about discipline and practice. But I really wasn't allowed to have a guitar. I couldn't have a guitar. And then eventually I bought a guitar, but I had to keep it at the neighbor's house. And but at a pretty young age, I started to play. I played in a band. We did play Crosby, Stills and Nash songs, but then I played in a band that would play bars. I knew about working as a
Hmm.
musician. I didn't really know about being original. I knew that if you played the Air Force Base, you had to make everybody happy by keeping them moving on the dance floor. And I learned that at a pretty young age.
Yes.
Um, and I learned, you know, like, or you get stuff thrown at you, which happened. But that I was young, and I had a steady gig playing down at the bar on the interstate. So, you know, I was working, kind of hiding it from my parents. Um, and then, like I said, in 1975, I went away to school in London, and that changed everything because I was living in a city that was vibrant with music, and things were changing in London rapidly. And I was there for that. And luckily, I got to peek in that door. And
Yes.
when I came back to the United States and finished up college, and then after college I moved to Paris. I had a grant, and I was living in Paris, and that's when I knew that all I really wanted to do was come back to New York City and play either CBGB's or Max's Kansas City.
Yes,
And I
it's interesting because a couple of probably last year I did an interview with a woman who was in the band. What it was one of the people in the band of Susans called Susan Stenger, and she had a sort of quite a kind of experience when she was 16. I think she wanted to she'd worked with John Cage, and then sort of got sent over to Czechoslovakia to study there, even though she couldn't speak the language, and then moved around. Were you also quite a proficient and obsessive kind of young person at that stage, just wanting to be pushed to the limits of your musical kind of horizons?
absolutely, when I was in Paris, I actually worked with John Cage. I signed up to be in a composing workshop, and I performed and with John Cage, and got to experience his world, his
Yes,
his universe. It was a life changer. It was
I would
beautiful.
imagine it was. It must have been because you were young. I mean, she was also quite young, and said, "Look, if you really like this type of classical music, you need to play with this guy." And it just happens to be in Czechoslovakia, and Americans can't go there, but we'll somehow smuggle you over there. You can't speak the language, but don't worry, that's just small details. I mean, she did it. I mean, I'm just, hearing your story, it sounded very sort of similar with these kind of paths crossing with people like John Cage and going to Paris when you were still relatively young. You probably, oh, I suppose there would have been a language issue sometimes, but yeah, culturally, it must have been quite extraordinary going from New York to Paris and into Europe.
Oh, extraordinary. I didn't go from New York. I went from Iowa. So I went from the country to Paris. I mean, this was a real big city I was living in, really for the first time. And I got to meet some extraordinary people and artists. And at that point, to your point, that's when I really knew that I wanted to come back to New York and play music. I wanted to, and I just haven't stopped since.
Yes, absolutely. Did you at that stage? I mean, because there was also, I mean, I had a older brother who introduced me to that world of prog rock and such like with people like Yes and Genesis and Wishbone Ash. Did any prog music ever sort of give you any kind of excitement or curiosity, or was it kind of jazz and then punk that sort of was the real catalyst?
Yeah, I had a prog rock moment.
Which one?
Yeah,
Which?
I definitely had a thing for Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer. I still kind of like Yes. Um, I went there. I saw, I definitely saw King Crimson. I love No Pussyfooting, that first record with Eno.
Yes.
Everything about that record, the cover with the weird mirrors and the way they looked. And the music was so weird. I loved it. So
Yeah.
I was definitely into that. I was in a band called the Raybeats, which was formed with um, three guys that were in the Contortions. They had
Right.
been on a record produced by Brian Eno called No New York, and
Yes.
I was in a band with Lydia Lunch,
This is
and
Eight-Eyed Spy, isn't it?
yeah, that's it. And it didn't last very long, but Raybeats lasted a little bit longer, and we had a friend who actually worked for Yes. And so the first time that the Raybeats played England and Europe, we actually got to borrow equipment from Yes. And so we had Yes's first amplifiers, which were matching orange tie-dyed Fender dual Showmans.
Excellent.
Um, yeah, really excellent. Alan White, he had a rehearsal. He had a barn with all the Yes equipment, and he said, "Yeah, you can borrow whatever you want." And it all looked kind of awful and weird. And then underneath this tarp in the corner was this matching orange tie dye stuff with that very first Yes logo on it, and it was like, oh well, that's what I'm talking about. So we
This is
borrowed
it.
that. Yeah, that was cool.
Yes. Good old Alan White. What a beautiful man. Yes. Yes. He played a very early gig in 1971 with Terry Reid, Glastonbury
Yeah.
Festival. He was just such a dude, actually. So, but yeah, before then. So, when you first got into Eight Eyed Spy, was this kind of a, because one thing I've noticed, and it's a bit of a sweeping statement, but what the hell? I mean, American punk seems a lot more eclectic and arty than the UK punk scene. It's the UK punk quickly became quite a cliche and just very rock and roll and macho, whereas America, and especially New York, had this a lot more different sort of rhythms and styles, and punk didn't just mean looking like Sid Vicious and sort of having a bit of a style. It encompassed, I suppose, much more kind of the gay community. There was kind of rockabilly, psychobilly. There was kind of, there was just a lot more different sort of types of people about. So and then you had Z Records, which brought in this whole other world. You had people like the Mumps, didn't you, with dear old Christian Hoffman and his gang. Andy Warhol, all those kind of Keith Haring. So, that New York scene, and you had CBGB's and Max's Kansas City, it did seem very exciting at that stage. Did you just want to be much more experimental, when you got together as that sort of lineup with Lydia?
I don't know that it was all that conscious. Oddly, you just mentioned Christian. Our first Lydia was friends with Christian and Bradley Field, who was in, and we rehearsed at Christian's loft down on the Bowery, little tiny room where we did a lot of practicing. I think the musical inspiration for Eight Eyed Spy really was driven by George Scott, who had a wildly eclectic taste in music. And he and Lydia really wanted to form a band. Lydia didn't want to be in Teenage Jesus anymore, and George didn't want to be in the Contortions.
Yes.
And so luckily I was part of that. And I think George was really driven to some unique musical places. And I think Lydia was too. And we covered a lot of songs. And I think Lydia liked cartoon music. Lydia liked Satie. I remember I was making Lydia's solo record, and she talked about Eric Satie,
Yes.
her record Queen of Siam. And I remember talking about cartoon music, and I remember talking about the band Suicide and the Cramps. And I don't think it was as much that it was something that we set out to do as much as it was in the air. That's the way New York City was at that time.
Yes. I know.
There were choreographers, Philip Glass, Steve Reich, Ornette Coleman. I mean, everybody wanted to play in hip hop, in rock clubs. They were all filmmakers were in bands. Choreographers were dancing in rock clubs. Everybody was part of this energy of New York City. And it was a pretty spectacular place. So I don't think it was, like a blueprint. I think it was in the air.
Yes. Alongside, I guess, as well, I know this is like the simplified version of New York, but I guess it had been sort of quite run down and was cheap to get a place. I know I spoke to a guy who wrote the Mud Club, and he said he bought a place which was very cheap, and various people said, well, you could just go and stay in a loft in an apartment, and it was just very dirt cheap at that stage. And also, it theoretically is the birth of, I suppose everyone will claim it a bit, but, hip hop, rap music, punk music, disco, all came out of New York in that sort of very small period of time. So, and then you had the artistic community as well as these clubs. So I guess it did breed a lot of kind of creative kind of fluidity between different people and different groups.
Yeah, it's all about the real estate. Cheap rent was important, but it was bleak. You know, I had a loft in the Flower District, huge, where Eight Eye Spy rehearsed, uh, but there was no heat at night, no hot water, no heat on the weekends, no bathroom. Well, no,
No.
there was a toilet, but there was no shower, no kitchen. It was just this raw space. It was pretty bleak. And you know, I didn't know any better. I mean, and a lot of us did that kind of thing. You know, we had places like that. My rent was $60 a month. So I could, you know, I could be in a band and then eat dinner down at the bar at the happy hour. I could have a beer and eat bar food for nothing.
Yes.
We all did that.
It's interesting, isn't it? There was a book that came out a few years ago, I'm just looking at it, by Duncan Hannah, 20th Century Boy, who sort of wrote about that experience in the 70s doing sort of New York in the 80s. And
Yeah, I knew Duncan. I just found a book that he signed. I love that book, 20th Century Boy.
it captures a
It's a good
certain...
book.
And then I did an interview with Martin, is it BC, who did BC Studios. I think Brian Eno was part of helping him develop that with Bill Laswell as well, which sounded like one of those loft studio places that a lot of avant-garde bands and artists recorded in as well, like the Swans and such like.
Yeah.
So I guess there was kind of a lot of coming together, and I would love to have remembered it. But a few weeks ago, I did an interview with two people who just made a film, something like We All Want to Be Famous, about a particular artist in New York that no one ever sort of really heard of until quite, you know, I suppose he kind of slipped between Basquiat and Keith Haring and everybody else, and just disappeared in Europe. And you know, they tracked down where he might have died. And yeah, it was kind of interesting just how much is kind of being unearthed in the New York sort of art scene at the moment. So everybody's getting their memoirs and archives sorted out, aren't they? Really. So
Yeah, right. Yeah.
but also, I mean,
Yeah.
how did you sort of manage to navigate away from the drug problem during that time? Because I noticed that, or heard from most people, that it was very hard not to sort of become a junkie at that stage in life.
Yeah, you know, I was thinking about that yesterday, oddly, thinking, damn, I made it out of that time alive. I I managed to make it out alive. For me, it wasn't drugs as much as drinking, but it was around, and there were plenty of drugs around, and drugs were cheap, and drinking was easy. But I wanted to make music more than I wanted to be drunk. I wanted to
Yes.
make music more than I wanted to be high. Having George die of a heroin overdose, that was a wake-up call. Having friends die of overdoses and AIDS, you know, it was, I was much more interested in playing music.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Well, I guess it is a bit humbling. We always think we're quite invincible when we're at that age. We can stumble over a pavement. It's not going to be too much of a thing. Later on in life, stumbling on a pavement could send you to A&E and 6 months of sort of occupational therapists, which you just want to avoid, really. So yes, bad news. So when the first band, you know, with Lydia came to a close, did the Raybeats, did that come together quite organically? Did the sort of group of you sort of all find each other relatively easily at this stage?
Oh, very much so. But those bands happened at the same time, almost the exact same time. Maybe, you know, George again had an idea to form an instrumental band, and he wanted to keep playing with Don and Jody, who were in the Contortions.
Yes.
And Don had a loft down on Warren Street. I think the Cramps were next door. And we just wanted to be an instrumental rock and roll band. And it was pretty organic. I can't believe we did it. You know, we rehearsed a couple times and then we started to play. And that's a really important point to make, is that there were places to play. There were bars and clubs that encouraged us. And it wasn't just the bands. There were clubs that booked us. And they were around the city. I'm thinking of Tier 3 and Hillary and Hillary Yeager, who booked that club, and that's where I saw Glenn Branca and Reese Chatham and oh God, who knows? You know, just phenomenal nights. The Bush Tetris first show was with
Yes.
Spy at this club called Tier 3. There was the Mud Club. I think you mentioned the Mud Club, and that was at the end of the alley where I lived. And we could play there. We could play there. And there were other places too. You could really play. And so there was an infrastructure. There were magazines that would write about us. There was a critic named Robert Palmer who wrote
Oh,
for
yes.
who wrote for the New York Times, the New York Times. And there was also the New York Rocker and the Soho Weekly News. And they would write articles. So if you in the Village Voice, and so if you had an article about you in the Village Voice, then you could play Washington, D.C. or Toronto. And I'm still in touch with the people that booked me in Toronto for the first time.
Amazing.
This is really important. There was a support, there was an infrastructure.
It was interesting
And it
because
was like,
I was going to say it was interesting
go
because I
ahead.
did an interview with I know it's slightly different type of music, but JJ French from the Twisted Sister, who said they spent all the sort of late 60s and 70s just playing constantly, like 2-3 times a night, you know, every day of the week, just to sort of keep the band going. But they couldn't get a record deal until the early 80s. But the live scene was such that, you know, a band could keep that as their kind of main hustle. They didn't have to particularly get a day job, and they would just kind of play constantly. So New York obviously was able to support such a sort of thriving artistic kind of band, you know, musical setup, really. Couldn't, you know, just that you could always get that gig and sort of keep it going and kind of exploring. I mean, obviously with them, they eventually got a record deal via bizarrely the Tube, which was a sort of program from the UK, but that's a long story really. But yes, but you obviously with the Raybeats, you know, had the same thing. You could keep working as a musician full time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't like a big payday, but we could make a 45. We got a record deal with a UK company. We got a record deal with Beggar's Banquet. And we were able to make a record. We would make a 45. You could take it down to the bar and put it in the jukebox. You could take it to the strip club and they would play it. And, you know, there was a world of music around. There was a world of creativity, is a better way to put it. You know,
Yes.
people were making things. It was
And also,
great. You know, great painters. You mentioned Jean-Michel, but you know, there there were other painters too. There was Keith Haring and Kenny Scharf, and maybe I would add like other artists like Robin Winters, and there were filmmakers, Jim Jarmusch and Amos Poe and Betty Gordon and Vivian
yes.
Dick, and now you know Nan Golden was making her photographs, and people were making things. There were alternative spaces like Artist Space and the Franklin Furnace and the Kitchen. You know, there were real places to show this work.
Yes.
It's really important to remember that.
And so Guitar Beat, which was your debut album, this was actually recorded in the UK, wasn't it, with Martin Rushett?
That's correct.
How did you manage to get from New York to the UK? I mean, it's kind of weird because there was a rockabilly band called the Rockettes who got picked up from Essex in the UK and taken over to New York by a guy called Lee Black Childers, and sort of, you know, one of the members, Smutty Smith, got photographed by Robert Mapplethorpe, and it became quite an iconic picture because he's kind of beautiful and got great tattoos. But so, you know, that was quite bizarre because most of the band weren't that great as musicians. But how did you manage to go from New York to the UK in the opposite direction?
Well, I certainly remember the Rockettes well, and I know that the Raybeats played on bills with them. So I knew Smutty, but we just asked them. Somebody at the record company said that they knew Martin, and he was just building a new studio. He had just produced Pete Shelley,
Yes.
and he wanted to try out his studio, and we were the first band to play in the studio.
And there you go. And that, so how long were you in the UK for at that stage?
Well, it was a couple weeks to make the record. We stayed in this little town, I think Goring-on-Thames is what it's called.
Yes, Goring-on-Thames. There you go. Wood Cottage. This sounds like a very goodness me.
Yeah.
This is the most beautiful place in the world.
Yeah, it was great.
That was
And
quite.
we were the locals, you know. It was fun down at the pub. And we made the record and we came back and the record came out, and then we did a tour of the UK with an American band called the DBs, and we played everywhere. Oh, that was a rough tour. We played all over the UK. We played, oh God.
Yes, the circuit. Well, the UK, as you will know, you realize, is a sort of tiny place, isn't it? It's like, and every city has, which is quite close to each other, really, has a sort of an alternative venue or gig night. So, a lot of bands that I've interviewed, that is quite. In the early years, you can sort of feel like you get a bit of kind of action, traction, a bit of movement, and feel like you're playing in front of people that aren't just your friends and family and anybody else you can emotionally blackmail to go and see you. You can play in front of quite a different crowd of people, which is always good for a band. I mean, it was kind of interesting because at that point in the early 80s, I mean, it's funny, there's like, no one thinks they're part of the scene, but there are scenes. There's the God scene, there was New Paisley, there was, the post-punk world, psychobilly, anarcho-punk. I won't keep going on. But you don't really fit in any of those kind of sections, do you? It's kind of like a band who's not kind of got a particular kind of, oh, we'll put you in that market, really. So it was kind of interesting that you came out in the early 80s with that sort of an instrumental album.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it was a huge commercial success. But we managed to play.
Yes.
And, I mean, as it happens, we were just contacted by a label called Ace.
Oh, yes.
And they're going to release an album with bands that were produced by Martin Rushent, and we're going to be on it.
Yeah.
There's going to be the Stranglers and Pete Shelley, and I'm really, really, really excited about being a part of this record.
Yeah, I remember that. I think one of the people in on Ace or works for Ace Records was in one of these kind of rockabilly bands in the sort of 80s. I can't remember who he was, but I did an interview with him. He was now in California enjoying life, so I would imagine he might be quite in part of that project. Really, we love vanity projects. But yes, so then you have that album, then you sort of follow it up with It's Only a Movie, the second album. So with the band at that stage, were you back in New York recording this particular album?
Yeah, we made that record. Well, what had happened is we made a demo with the composer Philip Glass. And we thought, oh, this is great. And but we happened to get a record deal with Shawnee, who were kind of a reggae label, a reggae Irish music label. And I don't know why they signed us, but we did. They put out our record. And it was done in New York. We mixed it at Electric Lady Studios with Joe Blaney, who did a really great job. And we just kept playing. We didn't really know what we were doing, but we played everywhere. We played all around the country. LA, we played shows with the Go-Go's. We played shows with all sorts of bands opening, all around the country. I don't know how we did it, but we did it. And then when we were done, that demo that we made with Philip Glass got lost. We didn't know where it was. We kind of forgot about it. And it was really hard. This is around 1984, and it just got really hard for us to keep going. I don't think Shawnee wanted to put out another record with us. We didn't know what to do, so we just kind of fell apart.
Yes, because it's interesting at the time, because I didn't notice that last night. It was a band from America, Romeo Void, and they kind of had a fantastic sound with a brilliant saxophone player in the sort of the mix as well. Were you kind of, and there was also, because you mentioned Jim Jarmusch, and we all love Down by Law and Stranger Than Paradise, and the solo work of, is it John Lowry as well? I mean, if you're from the UK, everything looks very exotic and you want to sort of embrace the New York scene. It's when you're young, you're trying to make yourself look and feel more interested than than you really are. We're pretentious at that age, aren't we? Were you kind of, were you quite influenced with a lot of those kind of, movements as well, and other players?
Well, I don't think I was influenced, but we were playing at the same time. We played many shows with the Lounge Lizards, and I saw them many times. And John was around, and of course, everybody knew John and the band, and I've worked with many of the musicians in his band from the Lounge Lizards over the years. And
Yes.
Jim was in a band on the same label. He was in a band called the Del Byzantines with Phil Klein, I think, was in that band. I don't remember who else, but they were on the same label that we were on. So we played shows with them as well. And, we were just, it was what was in the air.
Yes.
I don't think I was influenced by them as much as just we are all making stuff. We were making things.
But I do know in the 80s, we also, embraced, obviously, art cinema. There was also French films like Betty Blue and Diva, and then Rosalind and the Lions. And the soundtrack to Betty Blue, I think it was very much like Eric Satie. Were you kind of aware and, at all sort of interested in those kind of moments as well? Fantastic.
Yeah, I love the soundtrack to Betty Blue. I have it on my computer. I love that. It was a very stylish sound. And oddly, I work with a director and a showrunner on Miss Jackie, on Dexter, New Blood. And he always talks about Betty Blue, the soundtrack to Betty Blue. He always mentions it. And yeah, I was definitely influenced by that. And I was influenced by many soundtracks at that time.
Oh, can I just, I might have to just, oh, wait a minute.
You got to do your thing. Go ahead.
Wait a minute. Jill? Is it? Oh, magic. There you go. I'm slightly hoarse. Yes. Sorry about that. So yeah, just to sort of pick up on that, I mean, as the 80s progressed in this country, obviously, being the UK, there was kind of different scenes that happened between there was the punk, there was the post-punk, there was all those other worlds. And then sort of 83 to 87, we had the years of the Smiths and that great world of indie pop. And then sort of around 87, there was another kind of change, because there was that world of ecstasy and another musical kind of scene that started. How was it for you at that point? Did you kind of have to sort of navigate any kind of tricky periods doing that?
I'm not 100% sure what you mean, but let me try there. I had to figure out what to do, like not being in a band anymore was hard. I was living with a woman named Julia Hayward, who was a performance artist. And I've kind of forgotten about this period of my work, but I've gotten in touch. She'd been in touch with me lately. And we had a band called T Venus with many different members, but the idea was kind of a visual, cinematic experience of sound and visuals. And we played on a tour that was sponsored by a performance space here in this country called The Kitchen.
Right.
Reese Chatham was on it. Fab Five Freddy and the Rocksteady Crew were on that tour. Eric Bogosian, Oliver Lake. And it was very eclectic, and we toured around, and we were making this kind of visual music It didn't last very long, but thankfully a record label is going to put some of this music out. And I just found out about this just the other day. But
Interesting.
but I was so I'm very excited about this. We're just going through the tapes now. And I'd forgotten about it, but there's a lot of music. Don and Jody from the Contortions are on some. I'm on some. Jim Sclavunas from Eight Eyed Spy is on some. He, of course, is now with Nick Cave and the
Yes.
Bads. There were other musicians who were a part of that band TVness, so I'm excited about that.
Yes.
But I got a job producing an artist, a woman named Deborah Ayal, who had a band called Romeo Void.
Yes,
and
I did an interview with the bass player last night.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Benjamin? No, what's his name?
Benjamin was the saxophone player.
He was a saxophone player, right? He just.
Frank. It was Frank I interviewed from Romeo
Frank,
Void.
Yeah, I remember Frank. And my friend Julia, the singer from TVness, she shot a Romeo Void video for a song called "Girl in Trouble."
That's it. Yes.
And so I got this job producing a record, and I think it was going to maybe be a Romeo Void record, but then Romeo Void broke up, and then it ended up being a Deborah solo record. And that took quite a lot of time. But I did that, and then I also produced a record by a band called Love Tractor. And in that time, I wrote music for a television show called Tales from the Dark Side. And I wrote some music for a film that Betty Gordon made called Variety. John Lurie wrote most of the music, but I wrote some music as well. And I just started to write music for movies and television. And I just started to think, oh, maybe I could do this.
Yes.
I didn't know how, but I just started to do it.
Amazing. How did you find working with Deborah? Was that quite an interesting one? Because this was her kind of strange language. So was this the first time in a studio with somebody?
No, Raybeats had played many shows with Deborah and with Romeo Void. I think Eight Eyed Spy did too. So I knew her pretty well.
Yes.
And she liked my bands, and we were friends. But I had never produced an album before.
Yes.
And it was a pretty big deal. I think it was on Columbia or something, or Sony. And so I didn't really know how to make a commercial record. But that's what they wanted. They wanted to have a commercial record.
Yeah. And how did you find, because it was Ben Bosey, wasn't he? He was the saxophone player who had been in Romeo Void, and he was also playing on that particular solo album first, who had an amazing sound as well. Did you sort of record him in the studio?
I don't remember, but we were friends.
Yes.
Is Benjamin on that record? He might be.
He is on that record, actually. That was 86 that came out, actually. So that was Deborah. And because at that stage, I think the band had quite an intense period. And I think they were sort of coming to that point where they were sort of slowly going in opposite directions and separate ways and stuff like that.
Yeah, it happens.
It does happen. It's inevitable. It's going to happen, isn't it? Really. So so performance art. So you'd managed to embrace that world as well, actually, from sort of keeping the interest in sort of, not because the Coquettes are from San Francisco area, aren't they? So from the sort of late.
Yeah, I definitely knew about them, actually.
Yes. So then, that's interesting. So then you got into doing more soundtracks. Was this suddenly something that you thought, this is going to pay the rent, and I can still keep my artistic integrity doing something that I like?
Well, I think that's important to mention that there's a little bit of difference between the image of that world and the reality. It wasn't like I thought I could make a living at it. There are some composers who know more about that than I do, who are very good at making a living, but I was just making music. I got a job. I had written music for some choreographers, a woman named Meg Eganton, a choreographer named Stephen Petronio, a choreographer named Victoria Marks, a choreographer named Pooh Kay. I was just starting to learn to write music for extended forms, not just a rock and roll song. And
yes,
and I performed at I performed music of my own at a space in New York called the Dance Theater Workshop, an alternative space, much like the Kitchen, but driven by a producer named David White. And David gave me a chance to perform, and it just so happened that my performance was reviewed in the New York Times. And it just so happened that somebody from the Turner Broadcasting read the review, and they were just starting a network, CNN, and they asked me if I could write for a documentary, and I ended up writing music for a couple documentary films, produced by Ted Turner, and
right.
And so it wasn't like I said, "Oh, this will be a way to make money." I just did it. There wasn't very much money. I was clueless about that, but
Yes,
it was like, "Oh, this is a great way to make music." And like I said, I love soundtracks. To this day, I listen to them, and it was a thrill for me to be a part of that world.
yeah. I mean, your discography, your filmography as a composer is quite phenomenal, isn't it? I mean, you really do get into the rhythm, don't you? From the late 80s right through decades of just absolutely being. Were you the kind of go-to person for sort of a soundtrack and a composition? Because up to sort of Dexter, New Blood, I mean, you
Yeah.
don't really have a
Well, I
year
don't know.
off.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if I was a go-to. I mean, the Raybeats played a show, a really notorious art show in Times Square called the Times Square Show,
Yes,
and that's where Keith Haring and Nan Golden and Kiki Smith and Jean-Michel. There were photographers, and there was music, and there was all sorts of stuff in this abandoned storefront on 42nd Street. And somebody from the Nickelodeon network had come down, and they were a fan of the Raybeats. And Nickelodeon was just starting to make cartoons. They had done Ren and Stimpy, and they were doing the Rugrats, which Mark Mothersbaugh was writing, and they were starting Rocko's Modern Life. And I was
yes.
and so I wrote the music for that cartoon. And that really was a thrill. And just so you know, the music for Rocko's Modern Life is just going to be released in a couple of weeks.
Amazing. That is
Yeah, it
amazing.
is amazing. After so many years of it never being heard, I'm going to start getting some of it out into the air. I am
Yes,
so
absolutely.
thrilled. You wouldn't believe that band. And so for 4 or 5 years, whatever, I was making the music for that cartoon. And at the same time, I got a phone call from Kate Pearson from the B52s who said, "Hey, we're gonna we're gonna start going out on the road. We're finishing up a record. Do you want to go?" And I said, "Hell yeah, I'll be in the B52s." So we that was like 1989.
Yes.
So I was writing music for these movies and cartoons, and then starting to play with the B52s.
My God, that must have been surreal. That was when they were absolutely at their height, wasn't it? Well,
Well, we didn't start out that way. it was just going to be like 3 weeks. We played CBGBs and little clubs, and we made a video for Love Shack, and it just exploded.
Yes, Love Shack. That was it, wasn't it? That suddenly got
Mhm.
another kick. So you were part of that band from '89 to 2008. That was kind of
Mhm.
quite a nice gig, actually. So you feel? I mean, at the time, whenever the moment is, we never feel like we kind of quite appreciate it because we're just in it. But looking back, being able to be in a band like that, as well as writing and composing all this film music, was that quite a beautiful period for you?
Hell yeah. Come on, man. The B52s had two top 10 records at the same time with Love Shack and Rome.
Yes.
Never in a million years did I imagine that to be possible. People all around the world know who the B52s are. And they are an amazing, we got to be a really, really good rock and roll band. But we got really good. But this is not your normal rock and roll band. This is not like the Rolling Stones, or we're not playing like blues songs. This is the B52s, and we're doing songs about Planet Claire and Mesopotamia and hot and lava and dancing this mess around or whatever. It was
Yes.
fun, man. It was cool. That's my kind of rock and roll band.
Yes.
Really
Actually,
special. Really nice.
the two songs I really love of theirs, I don't know, did you play the Private Idaho and also Give Me Back My Man? Were they two that were always in the set, or were they hit and miss?
Absolutely. There's a great video of us doing "Give Me Back My Man." Uh, man, chills would go up my spine every time we played "Give Me Back My Man." I love that song, and
Yes.
we really played it. Cindy just is such a gorgeous, powerful singer. And then, of
Yes.
course, "Private Idaho," that is such a unique song. Um, I remember playing that in a, excuse me, a stadium in Chile, and just in Santiago, I think, and having the whole stadium just saying, yelling, "You're living in your own private Idaho," and going, "Wow, this is amazing." I mean, and then I got to play I played the keyboard part, and we had a great drummer, Zach Alford, a great bass player named Sarah Lee, who had that I know both of them. I know everyone. I mean, we're still all in touch. And
Yes.
yeah, let me tell you, this is like, I never in a million years imagine I have that opportunity to play around the world, like we did with the B52s. It was a glorious experience.
Yeah. But then just a bit kind of jumping forward again, you have this other combo, don't you? The ambient country trio, Sus.
Mm-hmm.
SUSS. How did that sort of come together? What was the kind of the idea behind this particular musical adventure?
Well, one of the members of the band named Bob Holmes had this idea, like, to form a band that would be kind of based on the idea, like, what would it be like if Brian Eno produced Ennio Morricone?
Yes.
We were all friends, and we would meet. There were five of us, actually, and we would meet at this diner on Fifth Avenue every once in a while and just hang out. And we did this for a couple years, like, just having matzo ball soup and French fries, and talking about music. And Bob said, "You know what? Let's form a band." And so the five of us formed a band, and we made our first record called Ghost Box, which you can get on streaming services. And our label
Yes.
picked it up, called Northern Spy. And this is music I love. And now we're a trio. One member, Gary Lee, very sadly passed away, and the other guy, just William Garrett, was just too busy for the recording schedule that we had. We're now on our fourth record. we've just finished a record for a double record actually for Northern Spy, and we're going to play the entire record in about a week at a gallery space here in my neighborhood in New York, in Long Island City.
Yes.
We're going to play 4 nights in a row, 4 Friday nights, each side of the record. And then we're going to play the Big Ears Festival in Tennessee.
Amazing. Yeah, because actually you've been as prolific with that as with any of your other musical adventures, really, haven't you? Because you brought out 4 albums in basically 4 years. You brought out Ghost Box, then it was High Line, and then Wide Open Sky, Promise, and then Night Suite as well. So have you got another album that's just about to be either recorded or
Well, yeah, we have another record that we're making right now, but we're really focusing on the music from this double album. The record that you mentioned in there, Wide Open Sky, is a different record. That's a record I made with a friend here in the neighborhood, a trombone player named J. Walter Hawks. And he also writes music for cartoons. And we're just friends. And we just decided to make an album.
yes,
So that's not a Sus record.
that's not a
But
Sus record. Yes.
no. But you should check it out. It's a good record.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Go
I
on.
was going to say, I mean, with all the music that you've made and art you've made, have you, over the last couple of years, especially with lockdown, did you start trying to archive some of your bits and pieces and sort of get sort of other little things that have never been properly finished, sort of put in some form that you've thought, right, I can sort of nicely think that's been archived and it's now there available for the world to listen?
Yeah, I think about it. Maybe I should do it. I found a box full of tapes. I found some Raybeats tapes that I'm really excited about. I found that, I'll start that. I'll do it. I'll archive. I mean, I've got some time.
Yes, but it sounds like you have a lot of projects on as well. So with you've got some live dates coming up, and then what else have you got for the rest of the year?
Well, really, Sus has got some music that we're going to start recording, and I hope to be doing more performing. I'm really super excited about performing at Big Ears, the festival in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Yes.
It's their 10th year anniversary. John Zorn is going to be there, Los Lobos, Calexico, Bill Frisell. I'm just thrilled to be down there. And hopefully Sus will do more recording and performing. I'm thinking about performing the music from the cartoon Rocko's Modern Life. That music is going to come out in early April. And then hopefully in the fall, we'll get more music released from that cartoon and I'll perform it. I mean, you wouldn't believe who was in that band. I mean, it was a great band. And I would love to play that music somehow.
Yes.
So yeah, I've got a lot of things in the works.
Yes. I mean, if you could have whispered something to your like 16-year-old self starting out, is there anything in particular you would have thought, oh yes, that would have been a good thing to have been told, or that would have been a good thing to have focused on? I just wondered, because you've obviously got decades of experience and worked with so many people and recorded with so many different musicians. I just wondered if there was anything you'd thought, yeah, that would have been a good thing to have known when I started out in this interesting but sometimes murky world.
Yeah, it is kind of murky, isn't it?
Yes.
I would have liked to have paid a little more attention to the business. I'm not a good business person, and it's really easy to forget that it is a business. I've been lucky to do these soundtracks that have been like Dexter and Miss Jackie and SpongeBob, that have been on shows that have done really well, and so I don't have to worry about the business too much. Although, half the music is owned by someone else. I don't own it all.
Yes.
But I
It's
wouldn't mind. That's all. Just knowing a little bit more about the business and knowing that it's okay to get help.
Yes, this is true. I mean, and did your parents get to see your musical world take off and experience some of the kind of highlights and successes you had?
Yeah, they were super. As unsupportive as they were in the beginning, they became very supportive as it went along. They would be at every B52 show. They even came to see me play with Lydia. They came to see me play with the Raybeats many times. They were good parents. My parents loved the B52s. My mom, who is still alive, loves telling her friends all about the B52s. And yeah, that my dad got to see the B52s play. He got to see us on Tonight Show, and he got to see us on Jay Leno and whatever, so he was aware that the band was doing well. My dad was a good guy.
Yes. Well, that's nice. I mean, and also, I mean, was it about 10 years ago you got an honorary doctorate from a college, and then you sort of got into teaching as well? Has that been a important sort of chapter in your life as well, the educational part and the lecturing?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I gotta tell you, it's a big deal to me. I'd be lost without my students. They give me hope and inspiration.
Yes.
I I am so lucky to have them, and I'm so fortunate to be a teacher. It gives me hope. Yeah.
Yes. Well, it's good because I know as one gets older, I mean, it's almost like when you're younger, it would be better to hang out with some older people to sort of, get some ideas or get, a few words in your ear, about what's worth doing and what's not worth doing. But then as you get older, it's quite nice to hang out with younger people who are having a different conversation that isn't always about sort of medical appointments or medical ailments, and sort of be able to hear what's kind of
Yeah.
happening in a different world, which is a very different kind of vibe and conversation. So I think it must be quite nice to be able to sort of slip into a different world and to hear what's going on in other people's kind of universe, especially the younger generation. Because speaking to a lot of musicians, they often don't quite know how new musicians how it works, even though they've had a lot of period and a lot of their time making music and recording and touring and being on labels, they think, I don't have a clue how music now works. So you must be able to sort of have some idea of what it's like to be a young musician starting out.
Yeah. I mean, um, it's just I really believe the in the power of music and the power of teaching music. Not all these students are going to end up being musicians, and that's just the truth.
Yes.
But I'd like to think that studying music can prepare them for anything. Knowing about the Smiths, knowing about the Ramones, knowing about music for film, knowing about rock and roll, knowing about jazz, communicating the language of music, I think it can prepare you for anything.
Yes.
And I'm very honored and to be a part of it, to be honest with you. I want these students to be successful in life, and I think that education in the arts can prepare you for that.
Yes. Absolutely. You have to produce something, you have to get feedback, you have to sort of know how to take it and then know how to sort of do the next move, which is quite sometimes interesting and slightly humbling at times. So it's a good thing to do. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just with your own sort of with your catalog, if anybody was saying, look, what album do you particularly really love that, if you were going to listen to of your work, which one would you sort of pick and say, look, listen to this one, I think you'll like it? What's your sort of proudest album?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think I've made it yet. I'm
It's
just getting started.
excellent. I have to say, I was just talking to exciting things. Your Big Ears Festival, which is happening very soon, it's got the most extraordinary lineup. I mean, it is going to be quite an amazing event, isn't it?
The big ears.
The Big Ears Festival that you're
Yeah,
playing in.
it's amazing.
I mean, that's art with a capital A, isn't it? Really, that's going to push the boundaries of music. I mean, it's going to be
Yeah.
quite the audience, actually. Is it a how many people will be there as punters?
I have no idea. I'll let you know when I get home.
Yes, I
We're
hope you have
playing. We're playing. We're playing on the 31st here at the gallery, and then we're driving all night to get down to Knoxville. I'll let you know how many people. I think it's pretty well attended.
Yes,
It's a great
well,
festival.
I would imagine it's amazing. Well, look, Pat, thank you ever so much for giving me the time for this. This has been so brilliant, and I'm really grateful. And it's really nice that, yes, it was Frank from the Romeo Void that I interviewed last night. I think there was another member of the band I might interview as well, because they're reissuing all their back catalogue, and they've got a live album from 1980 that is just coming out for, I think it's Record Store Day, so it's one of those gigs. So I
Yeah,
think
I'm
that.
really excited about that. Deborah just told me about that, so I'm really excited about it.
Yes, and it's nice, they've got a great sound. So I'm pleased that a lot of these things that have been slightly forgotten or just left in the cupboard is being sort of brought out and repackaged and or just released for the first time. So hopefully they'll get some more fans and more people know their music because
Yeah.
yes, it's one of those bands that could have easily been forgotten, which is a terrible thing. But
Yeah.
anyway, there you go. But thank you ever so much, Pat. This has been amazing. So thank you for your time and
Thank you.
have a nice evening. Yes, or afternoon. Anyway,
Yeah.
keep in
Take
touch.
care.
You
You
too.
will.
Thanks a lot.
I
Take care.
will.
Bye-bye.
Please. Bye now.
Bye-bye. And that, dear listener, is the end of the interview. I'm sure you gathered that. Anyway, a massive thank you to Pat Irwin for giving me the time of that interview. This has been David Eastaugh, the C86 Show. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Just do C86 Show. All these interviews have been archived. Aren't you lucky? You can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. It's true. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.